Welcome to the Cary Podcast. It's a podcast about Cary. Now here is your host, Matthew Corey.
Thanks, Ted. Hello, everyone, and happy September. Welcome to another episode of the Cary Podcast, and this one is going to be something special. One of my former jobs was working at WRAL-TV. From 1999 to 2006, I was on the control room crew for the afternoon and evening newscasts. The fancy name for what I did was Chyron operator, which means I put people's names and sports scores on the screen during the newscasts. When I told people where I worked, one question I got asked a lot was, "What's Greg Fishel like?" On this show, you're going to find out. Greg was kind enough to take time out of his schedule to talk with me. We take a look back at his time at WRAL, some of the major weather events he covered, and some of the trips he took during his 4 decades on the air at WRAL-TV5. But before we get to that, I need to thank our sponsor, Pigfish Lane Antiques and Interiors. Pigfish Lane is more than just an antique store. It has furniture, artwork, rugs, lamps, jewelry, and all sorts of wonderful decorative items. Pigfish Lane also offers in-house custom framing and on-site lamp repair. And since the lamp repair and custom framing is done on-site, you don't have to worry about your property getting shipped off and possibly lost at some giant regional warehouse. For more information, check out their website at pigfishlane.com or come in and look around and see for yourself. Pigfish Lane is located at 5425 Hillsborough Street in Raleigh, just down the road from the fairgrounds. Pigfish Lane Antiques and Interiors. Interesting stuff. Joining me live via the internet, the one, the only, Greg Fishel, meteorology legend of Triangle TV. How are you doing, Mr. Fishel?
Well, I've been called worse. No, I'm doing fine. Can't complain at all. More blessed than I deserve to be.
All right, I appreciate you taking the time to do the show. You know, a lot of the people of Cary, they miss you, seeing you around, but they don't have to miss you because you actually have a online weathercast series that you do.
Yes, I do work on Facebook, and I'm a spokesperson for Blanton's Air Plumbing and Electric, which is a company actually based in Fayetteville, but they're expanding into the Triangle. And so I do a sponsored content for them on my Facebook business page. And then I also have a weather service on something called Patreon. And if you go to patreon.com, Patreon, /fishweather, all one word, then you'll have an opportunity to subscribe at 2 different levels. The basic weather video, which is a forecast for the Triangle, much like I did on television for years, is $3 a month. And then for an additional $2 a month, I take a deeper dive into the science behind the forecast for people that are interested in that. So I would appreciate anybody listening to this checking it out, at least giving it a try and see whether or not you find it useful or not.
Yeah, I mean, you were always just fascinated by not just the weather, but the science behind the weather, the conditions behind what's causing it to rain here because something's happening maybe over in the Triad area. I mean, it was always, I noticed that it was always fascinating to you.
Well, and the thing that I'm so appreciative of is that WRAL gave me the freedom to have a more science-oriented weathercast. And I know from attending conferences with other meteorologists, TV meteorologists across the country, is that their management said, no, the public doesn't want to be educated. The public doesn't want to learn. They just want to know if it's going to rain or not. And they were, I mean, some of these folks couldn't even show fronts on maps, and so the fact that the WRAL gave me that freedom for all those years, and I tell people the thing I'm most proud of is that I ignored 95% of what the consultants told me to do, and it worked.
I met a couple of those consultants, and you were right to ignore them.
I mean, there was one time when one of them told me, never talk about what you're not sure of. And I got more positive feedback when people would hear me say, I honestly don't know how this is going to turn out. Here are the 2 or 3 most plausible possibilities. but I can't pretend to be competent when I'm not. And what I found was that people appreciated the honesty. I mean, why pretend to be competent in something when you're not?
Very true. All right, so we're going to go back, sort of talk about briefly your time at WRAL. You showed up in 1981, right?
That's correct. Yeah, just after the dinosaurs became extinct.
And you're from Pennsylvania originally.
Lancaster, Pennsylvania, born and raised, and went to Penn State, which was very lucky because that's one of the premier institutions in the country for the science of meteorology, and it was in state 2.5 hours from where I grew up. So almost makes me think that maybe that was supposed to happen. Yeah.
And so you came down here in 81, and at the time RAL had like the legendary anchor Charlie Gaddy was there, and Bob DeBartoleten was the weather guy.
The biggest name in weather.
Oh yeah, until you started doing weekends.
Yeah, weekends and mornings. I think originally I had Monday and Tuesday off, and I worked Saturday and Sunday night, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday morning and noon. And then I talked the station into allowing me to do a quick turnaround from Sunday night to Monday morning so I could have Thursday and Friday off, which in my single days, I felt like were better days to have off than Monday and Tuesday, you know. And so they let me do that. And so that was my schedule until Bob retired in 1989.
You know, when he was retiring, did you realize one day you were going to be, I mean, for a while, you were probably one of the most recognized local TV people in the Triangle.
And it still makes me feel weird when people say that, because that wasn't my goal. Like when I got to Raleigh, I didn't say, well, my goal is to be one of the most recognized people in the Triangle. I simply shared my passion for the weather with people, and for whatever reason, it clicked. I can't tell you it was any part of any master plan or strategy or whatever, but for whatever reason, it just happened to work out, and obviously, I'm very grateful it did.
I think that's what made you such a good weather forecaster, because you weren't there for the glory, you were there for the science.
Right. And I felt, I'll be honest with you, in the early 80s, I had a chip on my shoulder because I felt like a lot of people thought that meteorology was not really a science, that it was basically people up there throwing darts and this type of thing. And I used to get very defensive about that. In fact, I was just kidding with somebody the other day that, sometimes people still kid with me and say, boy, it must be nice to have a job where you can be wrong half the time and still get paid. And I used to get really defensive about that. Now, if I hear that, I just kid back with them and I say, hey, it's good work if you can get it.
I remember one of the Facebook posts, I guess it was shortly after you had left, but one of the weather events was going on, and somebody posted, oh, we need Greg back. We haven't had a decent weather forecast since. And you responded, no, that Mike Mays is actually a very good meteorologist. And beyond that, he's just a wonderful guy.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, the whole crew there, now I can't, in all honesty, comment personally on some of the newer folks, because, I never had a chance to meet them. But certainly Elizabeth Gardner, Amy Wilmoth, Mike Mays, those are people I worked with for years, and they're just all very, very competent people, and more importantly, just very, very nice people. And so I always felt like, the Weather Center was in very good hands, whether or not I was there or not.
All right, so let's go back. I want to talk about just some of the big, I shouldn't say big weather, because that's kind of the nickname of the guy on Channel 11, but some of the major weather events that happened during your tenure. I think one of the big ones had to be Hurricane Fran back in '96.
Yep, and I was just down in Orlando this past weekend, not helping, but there to celebrate Jim Payne's retirement from WESH. He was there 23 years, and of course, before that, he was at WRAL.
Yep. And
I tell this story, and I embellish it a little bit just for fun, but one of the most embarrassing moments of my life is that when my wife called me after the 11 o'clock newscast the night that Fran was hitting, and she said, have you actually stepped outside to see how bad this is? And I had been looking at data all night long, and I saw gusts to 50 knots, and I figured, well, shoot, we get that in thunderstorms. That's no big deal. But what I didn't fully appreciate was the fact that this was not one momentary gust. This was just, relentless, minute after minute, hour after hour. So I walked outside and I saw transformers blowing and trees coming down, and I ran back in and got Jim, and I said, Jim, you need to come out here. And there was a breezeway that separates the two buildings at WRAL, the corporate side from the TV side. And I kid about the fact that we had this magical moment where we looked in each other's eyes and said, we got to go on the air from out here. And so we did every hour from midnight through 4. Of course, we didn't realize that very few people could watch us or listen to us because they didn't have power. So if they didn't have a battery-powered radio or a battery-powered TV, we were basically talking to dead air. And my glasses blew off at one point and went down the stairs to the gardens. And I'm blind as a bat without my glasses. So here I am in this, 60-mile-an-hour winds and torrential rain, reaching around with my hand, trying to find these glasses. And thank goodness I did. But that's one night that I will never forget. And driving home that morning, I think I had to take 3 or 4 alternate routes because there were so many trees blocking roads.
Oh, yeah.
And I remember there was $1 billion in Wake County just alone. And I know where I lived, we had like a block party every night for 2 weeks because nobody had power. So we all got our gas grills and get out in the cul-de-sac. And I'll never forget one of my neighbors saying, we ought to ask the power company to shut the power off once a month so we can all get reacquainted.
Yeah. I was here during I was in college in Wilmington at the time, but I came up here figuring I would dodge most of the hurricane. And Fran just followed I-40 straight up to Raleigh.
And, that was the other thing is that there was an anticipation that it was going to recurve to the north at some point. And it looked like late that evening, like that was beginning to happen. And so the National Hurricane Center, and I have no criticism on them for this at all, adjusted the track a little bit farther east so that the worst of it would have gone east of Raleigh. And it turned out to just be a wobble. And it just resumed its earlier course and came right up over Raleigh. And, the rest is history. So that's one thing I learned from that storm is that don't take short-term changes in track too seriously because it may not be a definitive trend. It may just be a little wobble, just like a top does, you know?
Oh, one postscript to your story about you and Jim Payne out in the breezeway during Hurricane Fran. Al Robinson and Tim King, 2 of the longtime crew guys at TV5, were out there with you.
Yes.
So
in fact, I saw that on a Facebook post.
I saw that too.
And they certainly were. And those guys don't get enough credit, obviously. But if they don't do their job well, then it really doesn't matter what the on-air people do. No. That they're absolutely essential. And in all honesty, probably don't get paid enough for what they do.
From what my memory was, that is true. One of the other big events, I think it was January of 2000 when we got over 20 inches of snow in the area.
Probably one of the worst forecasts I've ever made.
I remember watching the news, and I don't think it was you, but someone else was saying, all right, this should be moving out of here in about an hour or so. And it never moved. It just kept snowing and kept going. And we were gridlocked. It was funny because I had just started working at WRAL a few months earlier. And so David Crabtree is on TV telling everybody, stay home, stay off the roads. And at the same time, my manager from TV5 is on the phone with me saying, hey, can you come in?
Don't do as I say, or what is it? Don't do as I do, do as I say. Right?
That's right. And unfortunately, by that time, the apartment complex I was living in, there was no way to get out. And so I had to miss out on all the round-the-clock snow coverage.
Yeah, that was, by 11 o'clock, it was becoming fairly obvious that this was going to turn into something big. But at that point, it's basically what I call a nowcast. It's not really a forecast because it's in progress,
Yeah.
And earlier in the day, it didn't look like it was going to be anything more than a couple inches. And it turns out there was an erroneous upper air report in Georgia, one of the weather balloons. There was some very bad data that came out of it. And the theory is that affected the output of some of the numerical models to the point where they just, really did a terrible job. But it also was a wake-up call in the sense that sometimes we become too dependent on these models, because most of the times they're very good, but you have to look at actual observations, and those few times that they're out to lunch, it's our responsibility as scientists to recognize those situations and to adjust to it.
That's why, you need the human experience in there. It can't all just be, forecasts from computer models.
Yep, exactly.
So.
Exactly. And there's one other event. This was long before your time. The first big one that I experienced was the tornado outbreak in March of 1984. And I had played it up, not purely for the purposes of height, but when I looked at the overall weather pattern Monday and Tuesday, and this occurred on a Tuesday night, if I'm remembering correctly, that I was, really afraid it was going to be a major severe weather outbreak. About 9 o'clock that night, Tuesday night, we didn't have any reports of anything all that significant in any part of North Carolina. And I thought to myself, oh my gosh, I've blown this out of proportion. I've only been here 3 years. This is going to destroy my credibility. And I woke up the next morning and there are 57 people dead.
Oh, God, yeah. That was the one that the F5 tornado that decimated, I think it was either a Farmore or a Kmart or one of the big.
Oh, you're thinking of 88.
Oh, that's 88. Okay.
Yeah, the Raleigh tornado of 88, which was just a single tornado and did an incredible amount of damage. But yeah, this was a series of tornadoes that started in Georgia and went across South Carolina and then into southern North Carolina. And, I went from thinking, oh my gosh, I've blown it out of proportion to, oh my gosh, I didn't do enough. And that was just an amazing event. I think at one time that afternoon, it was like 48 in Greensboro and 80 at Fayetteville. So you sort of knew
something was up with the air.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, do people ever get mad at you for the weather?
Oh, sure. And this is one thing I tried to adapt to over the years, is that if you think about it, if you've lived in central North Carolina or eastern North Carolina for any length of time, in the summertime, you get these afternoon and evening thunderstorms, and it might rain an hour or maybe at most 2. Okay. And so you look at a 7-day forecast and you see the sun half covered by the cloud and a raindrop and a lightning bolt 5 days in a row. And you think, well, gosh, that looks pretty bad. I don't think I'm going to be able to play tennis or play golf or, do anything outside. And nothing could be farther from the truth. If you have 14 and a half hours of daylight, which is what we have here in June, July, and it rains for an hour or even 2, that means you got 12 to 13 hours where it's not doing anything.
Yeah.
And so this is one thing I tried to emphasize, is very few times in the summer in North Carolina do you get day-long washouts. And that usually, even on an unsettled day, there are several hours that are rain-free and perfectly okay for doing things outside. And so I sort of learned over time that I didn't want to, mischaracterize the day and make people think it was going to be worse than, it actually was going to be.
One other weather event to bring up. I think this one is the one that was called Snowmageddon. I think there's a couple that have picked up that name here, but it was the time we had less than an inch of precipitation. I think this was 2005, and we less than an inch, and it paralyzed Raleigh and most of Wake County.
Yes.
It was just like everything that could have gone wrong did at the right time.
And I met a gentleman out at a conference that I attended later that year who was an expert in how cars interacting with snow on a road surface and so forth, what can happen there. And this was forecast to be just a few flurries, and it had been very cold. I mean, I don't think we've been above freezing for like 2 or 3 days, really unusually cold for North Carolina. And so it started flurrying. And as soon as it started to dust the ground a little bit, people started to panic and think, well, this looks like more than flurries. We better let everybody go. And so all these cars and trucks and so forth got out and started driving on this very, very, light, dusty like snow. And in a matter of a second, the pressure from the tires would melt the snow. And then because of the cold ground, it would refreeze instantaneously. And so basically what all the human activity did was turn an innocent powdery snow into an ice rink. And as a result, there were, students and teachers that stayed at school all night long. There were, stories about 8 hours to get home from work. And you're right. I think it was 0.7 inches of snow. And we were sort of the laughing stock, of the country, because people said, my gosh, less than an inch of snow and it paralyzes the area. But it was a pretty unique situation, where a lot of things had to come together to produce that ice rink effect. And it certainly did.
I mean, you had the roads were full of cars and they were stuck. So the plows couldn't even get out.
Right.
I mean, everything was gridlocked.
Exactly. No, that was an amazing. I remember like being on the air that night and Sky 5, showing a picture of I-40, and it was just lights as far as you could see. It was utterly amazing.
Yeah. So what were some of the fun trips that you got to take to cover weather? Because normally you would be in the studio. They would send Elizabeth or some of the other meteorologists or just some of the regular reporters out to the beach to cover the hurricanes, or in some cases they would go to the mountains to cover the hurricane coming through. That was an odd one when they got on 40 and went west to cover the hurricane.
Right.
But you did get to take a few nice trips while you were there, right?
Yes, there was a big lake effect outbreak up at Buffalo, just south of Buffalo, where they got 80 inches of snow. And Jim Goodman, who was the owner of Capital Broadcasting for years, he saw a report about this, and apparently the word I have it is that he thought to himself, we got to get Greg up there because he loves snow so much. And so Richard Atkins and I went up there and spent a few days. And then the other thing was, when I was at Penn State, being the snow lover that I was fascinated by Barrow, Alaska, which is the farthest north point in the United States. It's on the Arctic Ocean. And I actually looked up the area code for that part of Alaska, dialed the area code followed by 555-1212, which was information back then. And I asked for the number for the Barrow Chamber of Commerce, not even knowing if there was one. And they gave me a number, and then I made up the last 4 digits, and I called a random number in Barrow. And this nice man answered, I think it was in October, and I said, I'm a meteorology major at Penn State, and I just want to know how much snow you had on the ground up there. And we had a nice talk for about 5 minutes. And from that point forward, I had always wanted to go there. And then when the climate change issue came along, I found out that Barrow was, I think, one of the 6 global observing stations that measures concentrations of greenhouse gases. And I figured, aha, now I've got an in. I can get up there and satisfy my own personal curiosity, and I can do a story that's actually relevant and, interview people up there, the scientists up there and so forth. And so we did a half-hour documentary about climate change based on that trip. And that was very, very fun. I had never seen a frozen ocean before. That was a very cool experience.
I guess one of the shortest trips that you took was to the fountain in the WRAL Gardens.
I had no clue that an innocent comment that I made on the 6 o'clock news one night was going to turn into this circus. I basically just was so confident that the pattern was eventually going to bring us snow that I said, if there isn't measurable snow at the airport within 2 weeks, I'll jump in the fountain. And it did end up snowing at Roxborough, but never snowed measurably at the airport. And so I had to go in. And the promotion department just saw this as a grand opportunity to get some attention. And so I'll never forget that night. I mean, there was actually a crowd,
It was an event.
And I remember Dr. Mast out there doing stories about hypothermia, and I said, "Uh-oh, what am I setting myself up for?" Yeah, that was an amazing experience. There's so many little cool things like that happened, over the years. That those are memories that I'll always cherish.
So how did things change with weather forecasting from when you got to TV5 in 81 compared to 2019?
Well, when I got there, we had, I actually requested that we get this, and we did, a wet paper facsimile machine where there was a little drum, sort of like a barber pole, that spun like this, and it had a helix on it. And so the helix spun around, and as it spun around, it like basically made contact with this bar and burned one line at a time into this wet paper. And so we got very basic computer model information, like at 12-hour intervals and maybe at 3 different layers, and that was it. And then we had a couple of teletypes, Western Union teletypes, which are like typewriters hooked up to a phone line. And that would give us all the observations at the different airports. And I remember in January of 1982, it was the first winter I was there, they premiered the Weather Center. I mean, they built a whole new set and they premiered it. And the week they premiered it, we got a half a foot of snow. And I think I heard a story that one of the competitors contacted the news director at WRAL at the time and said, it's not really fair when God's on your side, Anyways, that was really all we had back then. And then slowly the facsimile machines evolved into dot matrix printers. And then I remember we had a request reply terminal where you put a phone into 2 rubber cups and you dialed a phone number and you heard a ding like that, and it would hook up, and then you would type in commands based on what you wanted to look at, and then it would reply and print you
like
out
an early form of a modem.
Right, exactly. And then I guess it would have been around like 1990 or the early 90s when the internet started to.
The late 90s, it was like mid 90s. We had dial up with like America Online and that sort of thing. And then I think we started to go to DSL around the end of the 90s.
Okay. Because I just remember that the neat thing about it was that now, for the first time, I had access to computer model forecasts that were higher resolution. And basically, I could look at any variable the model was predicting at no worse than 1-hour intervals, whereas before it was 12-hour intervals and only a couple of specified, levels of the atmosphere. And there was a program, a DOS program, that was called PC Grids, and I just thought that was the highest darn tech thing I'd ever seen, and was able to look at things I had never looked at before, and it was really fascinating. And then something that happened in the last several years I was at WRAL, Nate Johnson, who was a meteorologist with us, had a dual major at NC State, meteorology and computer science. And so he knew a lot about programming. And so, every TV station has a vendor that they subscribe to get all the information they need to make their graphics. Well, a lot of these companies didn't make stuff available that I wanted to show. And so Nate helped me figure out a way to write very simple computer programs and reformat government data into a format that our graphics system could read. And so I was able to show stuff on the air that literally no one else in the country was showing because their vendors didn't make it available to them. And so that was exciting because every morning when I got up, if I had an idea, there was a darn good chance I could get that idea on the air by that night. And that really kept me motivated, in the last several years that I was at the station.
And I mean, how nice is it now that, you can download the WRAL app,
right?
The weather app, and you have access to, local radar and all these other, these tools. I would imagine that's kind of what makes it possible for you to do your Patreon weathercasts without having to invest in your own Doppler radar and
Oh, yeah.
probably millions of dollars worth of equipment.
Yeah, oh, exactly. And, the European model, which is generally acknowledged to be, this superior modeling system in the world, their government, last I heard, charges $200,000 a year to get all of their products. Well, most people can't afford that. And so there are a few stations or a few companies out there that have bitten the bullet, but they make up the money by charging subscription fees of like, $20 a month, $30 a month or whatever. You get enough of those, it helps pay for it. And so thank goodness that there are companies out there that are making that information available, because otherwise I wouldn't be able to afford it for sure.
Yeah.
But I will always cherish, the opportunity that I got at WRAL way back in 1981. And Bob DeBartolome was so supportive of me for the 8 years that we worked together. And I think that helped because people love Bob and they figure, well, if Bob likes this guy, he can't be too bad, And then the freedom they gave me over the years to do and say basically what I wanted to do and the way I wanted to do it. Not too many people get the chance to sort of write their own book and write their own story like that. And so looking back on it, pretty lucky man.
All right. Well, we're going to do another episode for you. So Greg's going to be back next week. But for now, thank you very much, Greg.
Thank you.
And we'll talk to you soon.
All right. Take care.
My thanks again to Greg Fishel. As I said at the top of the show, I used to work at WRAL on the control room crew, and I just want to say that Greg was one of the nicest people in the building. He treated us on the crew with the same amount of courtesy and respect as he did the other on-air newscasters. He really is a genuinely nice guy. Greg is also an expert when it comes to Triangle area weather, and if you want to get access to his weather videos that cover Central North Carolina, go to patreon.com/fishweather, and that's all one word. I'll put that link in the podcast show notes. Give it a try for a few months. And if your heating or AC unit needs some work, give Blanton's a try. Their website is blantonsair.com. Tell them Greg Fishel sent you. That's all for this show. My thanks again to Pigfish Lane Antiques and Interiors for their generous sponsorship, and my thanks to all of you for listening. I'll be back next week with Greg Fishel again, and we're going to talk about the weather. Until then, carry on.
The Cary Podcast is a private entity, not officially affiliated with the town of Cary. All guest opinions are their own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Cary Podcast, its participants, affiliates, or advertisers. Theme music provided by Saints Apollo. Find their albums at iTunes and on Bandcamp.com. Matthew Corey is the author of the novels Remember the Roller Dogs and Cue Me, My Star Trek Story, both available at Amazon.com. And also special thanks to Jimmy Benedict. This is Ted Harrison saying thanks for listening, and join us again next time for the Cary Podcast.